Okay, thanks everybody for coming on a cold morning, early morning. My name is Grayson. I'm an architect at Paul Castrucci Architects, part of the Social Equity and Resilience Subcommittee of AIA New York COAT. And I'm really pleased to present this panel on resiliency and social equity. Fires, flooding, extreme heat have been affecting local, national, global communities for a while now. Longstanding economic planning and design practices places the burden of those events disproportionately on low-income communities. And so as designers, what tools are available to us to address those issues, and how do we identify what the problems are that we need to solve, not just for today, but in a rapidly changing climate? What are those problems going to be in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? I'm thrilled to present this panel with Jennifer, Ilya, and Daniel. Combined, they have decades of experience addressing these issues at the planning level throughout the city, but also on projects big and small, sort of in the city, but also globally. The intersection of their expertise and the dialogue that we're going to hear today is going to provide a holistic and really insightful perspective on the stakes of resilience and equity. So I'm not going to say too much more. I'm going to let these guys get to it. But what we're going to do today is we're going to have 3 presentations from Jen, Ilya, and Daniel. Then we're going to do a moderate discussion, and then we'll leave 20 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. So before we get started, let me please introduce the speakers. Up first, we're going to have Jennifer Bloom-Leone. She is the Chief Sustainability Officer for New York City HPD, the largest municipal housing finance agency in the country. Her work includes setting a holistic sustainability agenda and policy for the agency, ensuring that projects are low carbon, energy efficient, and resilient, while addressing the unique health and safety needs of the vulnerable populations HPD supports. Included in this role is participation in numerous climate and energy working groups to represent affordable housing and ensure that this sector is able to participate in and benefit from New York City's aggressive decarbonization agenda. Next up, we'll have Ilya Azaroff, who's professor in practice at New York City of Technology and founding principal of Plus Lab Architects. Ilya is an internationally recognized leader in disaster mitigation, resilient planning, and regenerative design strategies. His firm's work focuses on creating sustainable and regenerative futures for underserved communities. Ilya's office advances culturally significant community resilience hubs and regenerative cluster housing in communities throughout the world. Ilya has served as COP27 delegate and leads the COP28 AIA team. He's the technical advisor for New York State Climate Impact Assessment for the Governor's Office. He is currently working with New York City OEM on a New York City hazard mitigation plan and served as the New York State coordinator for the AIA Unified Task Force addressing COVID-19. He has advised HUD as a member of the Alliance for National Community Resilience and is the founding director of Kalinago Institute for Global Resilience and Regeneration on the island of Dominica. Ilya was deployed by the U.S. State Department to the Republic of Turkey and Kyrgyzstan to address the devastating earthquakes in 2023. Ilya served as the 2021 AIA New York State President and is currently the at-large director of the AIA National Board. Finally, we have Daniel Huberger, whose design leadership is informed by a belief in architecture's broad public mission, through an active engagement in each phase of design, from concept through execution. He directs institutional, educational, housing, and planning projects. As a mentor and consensus builder, he facilitates dialogue among design professionals and clients, enabling collaboration and unifying project goals. As an active member of the AIA New York, Daniel has served on the School Construction Authority Task Force, Design Awards Committees, and the Oculus Committee. He has lectured on design to multiple professional groups, including the U.S. Green Building Council, Society of University and College Planners, and the AIA. Daniel has been a guest critic at several schools. He holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Columbia and a Master of Architecture from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. And I think I missed, Daniel is with Datner Architects. So without further ado, we'll welcome Jennifer up to the stage, and thank you. Enjoy.
Good morning. I think everyone can hear me. I'm listening to that, thinking I better up the ante on my own resume. Mine was a little light compared to these guys. Anyway, let's see if I can get the slides going. So, as noted, my name's Jen Leone. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at HPD. I start every presentation with a little primer on what is HPD, because it turns out a lot of people don't actually know what we do. So Grayson mentioned that we're the largest municipal developer of affordable housing in the country. What does that mean? We're not really developers. We finance the preservation and construction of affordable housing in New York City. And we also are responsible for affordable housing policy citywide, enforcement of the Housing Maintenance Code, and a lot of other similar activities. So we're doing a lot. We also have a really good track record of sustainable buildings. HPD buildings have been subject to Enterprise Green Communities or LEED since 2016, but our projects and some of our architects and development teams are doing much, much more. And you can see some really stellar examples on the screen, including some from folks on this panel, right? We're doing passive house, we're doing high performance buildings, and so on. And not only are they high performance, they're really beautiful and interesting. Same goes for work in our preservation portfolio, right? Everything from solar, to deep energy retrofits, and finally even one passive house retrofit project that we've done to date, right? So this is important. It's really important to our mission of producing high quality housing across the 5 boroughs. We've been doing a lot of things since the Enterprise Green and LEED requirement rolled in, and just a few of them that I'm not going to focus on so much today, but for background, we launched our Solar Where Feasible program in 2020, which requires solar on all projects that we finance where it makes financial sense. In 2022, we launched our $24 million joint retrofit electrification pilot with NYSERDA, and we are trying to electrify really challenging preservation buildings in our HPD pipeline. And what's interesting from a resiliency standpoint, right, is we're focusing not just on buildings on oil, but buildings in flood zones where there's repeated flooding of equipment. So that's sort of the resiliency tie-in there. In 2023, we launched our Future Housing Initiative to fund all electric passive house projects in our new construction pipeline. There might be some folks in that program here today, but I won't go into that. And in 2024, stay tuned. Earth Day's coming. We always have something fun and new to announce at that point. None of the work we do, though, would be here if the city didn't have ambitious climate agenda to begin with, right? It's really hard for us. We love to be ahead of the game city-wise, but we do need a baseline agenda to make our work successful and to get buy-in. I think everybody is pretty familiar with all of the Plan YCs that have happened since the Bloomberg era. Everything from a 30% greenhouse gas reduction in the original Plan YC, right? One city built to last embedded the 80 by 50 criteria that de Blasio put into place, followed by the Climate Mobilization Act. And now, you can't really see the slide, but today's Plan YC under the Adams administration, which is really about just getting all of these ambitious goals done. And that's super important. We already have sort of the end goal, and we need to focus on doing it. But today I want to focus mostly on resiliency. That's the purpose of this panel and what we're doing. So in 2018, the first climate resiliency design guidelines were released, and that's really important because everything in this manual and in this report set the stage for the resiliency work that city projects will have to follow, and that includes HPD projects. What is in the climate resiliency design guidelines? Has anyone actually read them? Show of hands. Okay, well, really good resource to look at. They focus on the 3 key risks for New York City, right? Increasing heat, increasing precipitation, and sea level rise, right? There are plenty of other risks we're not talking about and we are starting to see, like, remember wildfire risk a couple summers ago, high winds, all of these other things, but in New York City, these are the 3 key risks we're focusing on. The guidelines also reference new maps, right? We can't design for risk if we can't find the risk, and find the sites that are subject to these risks. So part of the guidelines was the city figuring out what sea level rise looks like over time, where flooding happens, and where heat risk is more extreme. The other things in the guidelines are a risk exposure screening tool, which is really important so that designers know where risk is to start with. Cost-benefit methodology, and then, of course, design strategies to address risk. Way back when, I'm sorry, back in 2020, we thought, okay, we've got these great resiliency design guidelines. How do we baby step into that for HPD projects? So we started by integrating the risk exposure screening into all HPD new construction and substantial rehab projects through the Enterprise Green New York City overlay and for LEED projects, right? So now all buildings coming through our pipeline have to at least understand the risks that they were facing geographically, right? And then we put some optional criteria in to say, if you are subject to this risk, we want to see you try and achieve these design goals. A little bit more about the exposure screening and the specific risks that we're talking about. So designing for heat risk references the heat vulnerability map in New York City, right, which is an aggregated map of income levels, ground cover, and so on, right, to really show which parts of the city there's increased risk for heat. For precipitation, the city finally was able to produce stormwater maps, and this is really talking about inland stormwater, right? Not coastal, but the stormwater from rainy day events and extreme precipitation. And like, I live near Gowanus, we see this all the time. Granted, there's a canal there, but we all know what we're talking about, and now we can identify parts of the city where there is flooding that we have to be aware of. And finally, sea level rise. This is obviously more in the forefront. Appendix G already talks about risk, but the FEMA maps are not sufficient to cover future risk, right? So these new maps, and by the way, we can share the presentation. There's links to all the maps in the presentation in HPD design guidelines, but this shows what tidal inundation and sea level rise will look like, coastal flooding, through 2100 under different periods. So that's really important to predict what risk a site will face. Anyway, the risk exposure was not enough, and in 2022, we committed to fast-tracking decarbonization and resiliency for affordable housing. And that was part of our housing blueprint and our citywide commitment, right? And we said, we're gonna go further in addressing these risks and in decarbonizing our buildings. And we were gonna do that by incubating, piloting, and releasing sustainable design guidelines that focus on both decarbonization and resiliency. We were lucky because the CRDG already gave us strategies to design for these three risks. And I'm not gonna go through the slide. You all probably know most of these design strategies. But we were able to leverage these and integrate them into our design guidelines in a prescriptive way with both mandatory and reach criteria that buildings could achieve if they were subject to any of the risks. So these are our recently released design guidelines. For the first time ever, we have design guidelines for existing buildings, and that's brand new for HPD. And we have different stepping up design guidelines for moderate rehabs, sub and gut rehabs, and new construction, right? And the criteria steps up accordingly. Strategic electrification and strategic resiliency for rehabs, and full-on electrification and climate resilient design for new construction. The goals here are really good buildings, right? We want buildings that are addressing the climate risks they face, right? For sea level rise, heat, stormwater flooding, and so on. But we can't just do that. There's a lot of co-benefits to tying that with decarbonization. This is kind of a little hacked up cartoon of integrating heat pumps into our buildings, but we all know that these two things work really well together to make good buildings, and that's what our guidelines are about. Specifically, here are some of the criteria in our different guidelines, and this is just not a non-exhaustive list. We encourage everybody to take a look at our guidelines because we think they're well ahead of what the code requires They're ahead of LEED, and we're trying to be the leading edge of sustainable and resilient design. Like I said before, the rehab requirements are strategic electrification, focusing on oil buildings, buildings in flood zones, and we want to see new equipment protected, right? We don't want to invest in equipment that is subject to flood risk, right? We think that's really important, and we want to electrify the worst performing buildings first. There's also some less sexy measures in here, like backflow valves and tenant notification and awareness for flooding, right? It's harder to integrate resiliency into rehabs, but we're doing what we can as our first set of mandatory criteria. We also want to address heat risk by requiring cooling for seniors, making sure there are outlets for AC units on all of our buildings, right? And anywhere there's new finishes, new paving, new surfaces, we want them to be resilient if they're facing any kind of flood risk. So that is our starting point in our first ever design guidelines for rehabs. We do have some REACH criteria, some of which are big, passive house, some of which are small, like ceiling fans. For new construction, bigger goals, it's much easier to go further on new buildings, right? Before pencil goes to paper, read our guidelines, understand what we're expecting of you, and then all of our buildings will be, designed to be as resilient and future forward as they can. So full electrification, all residential uses and critical equipment are either above grade for inland stormwater flooding or above the 2080s sea level rise adjusted design flood elevations, right? We don't want to see anything put in at-risk areas when we know where the risks are. A couple other things like place of refuge and backup power for seniors, right? We want to target our most vulnerable populations with our guidelines. And some other things, shaded open space for senior and low mobility populations. Where do you go if it's really hot? Maybe up on the roof. And then some other of the less sexy criteria. Now, one thing, these are all really hard to achieve, right? It's not that easy to do the perfect building. For that reason, we integrated design waivers. When we said we're going to set a really ambitious agenda, we said we've got to leave a backstop or some relief where none of this is, or where some of these criteria are not feasible. So we handled that through a design waiver process. If a project comes to us, we want to know early what's not achievable, right? And not only do we want to know what's not achievable, but we want to know why. Is it a technical reason, a financial reason? Is it a zoning issue? And through the design waiver process, we're going to collect and gather really good information to inform future policy, future standards, and to take back to our friends at the DOB and city planning and say, here are the things we've learned through all of the projects that come through our pipeline. And this is where we can push policy, right, from where we stand, because we have a big pipeline and we're ahead of the game. And thanks to Datner for helping us kind of sketch out what we might need as a design waiver requirement. Like I said, it's all about collecting good information. So a couple other things outside our design guidelines that we're doing at HPD. The CRDG through the Mayor's Office of MACHI-J, whatever, I'm not going to go through the acronym, so I always forget what it stands for, right? They're piloting projects for the climate resiliency design guidelines. The guidelines will be mandatory starting in 2026 for city buildings. So through this process, the Mayor's Office is refining the requirements. There's 3 retrofit and new construction pilot projects in HPD's cohort, and that's how they're figuring out how to refine the actual rules. Now we're trying to get ahead of it with our guidelines, and hopefully that will also be informative. Whoops, wrong thing. Recently, we got $9 million in grant funding to integrate 2 community resiliency hubs in our senior housing projects, right? It's free money. We want to see what we can do with that. So there's 2 projects that got funding, and they can serve both the residents and the community by integrating a community space that has backup heating, power, cooling, outdoor space, and that way, in the event of an emergency, there's a local place for the community to go and be served and helped. We do a climate-ready buildings training, right? Our projects are required to go through certain trainings as part of our program. This trains, I think a lot of people in the room already know this, but how to do a good building that is both resilient and sustainable, right? And how to integrate them and why. So there's case studies, and it really talks about how you can make the good, best building that we want to see for our projects. Flood Help New York, it's an interagency effort to bring resources about flood to building owners and renters, and we engage in that. And finally, we have our RFP process, where projects on public sites are competitively procured through an RFP process, and we're trying to integrate innovation, high performance into all of our RFPs, right? This is where we see the leading edge of good design, right? These projects come through, they're exemplary, they're like the lighthouse of where we want to be going with our projects. So a couple recent ones, and some people might remember Sendero Verde, which was our first passive house RFP, which really led the way for passive house to scale up in New York City. And we want to see that happen with innovation and resiliency as well. Last thing I'll say is we could do none of this without ongoing collaboration. Nothing we do is not totally interwoven with the people we work with. So our sister agencies, right, our design guidelines come from the requirements and best practices from DSNY, Mayor's Office, Department of Health, right? Everything gets integrated into one place. We work with our sister housing agencies to make sure that with the same goals, we're trying to do the same thing, right, and align all of our requirements. NYSERDA, who funds pretty much everything that my team is doing. And finally, folks like you guys, right? We absolutely can't do any of this work if the leading edge architects aren't doing it first and letting us know what's possible, right? That's where the innovation comes in. That's where we engage to make sure that we're following the leaders and bringing everybody else along. And with that, I'll pass it on to Ilya.
Wow, that was great. Jennifer, that's amazing. And it's really great to be in a city that is very forward-thinking in the agencies. Seriously. Working in a lot of places around the world puts me in a position that I can make that evaluation. And New York City does have some incredible agencies and collaborative efforts to lead on climate action. So I'm not going to belabor who I am, because I think Grayson did a really nice job of putting way too much information out there. But it's great to be here today. I'm going to wear two hats today. One, just as a firm owner, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework for design excellence. So I work all around the world, pre and post disaster, and trying to bring communities to a really quite better place. And in fact, my office, we work everywhere. This is supposed to be a map of the world, just showing where we've had engagements. But it's about the health, safety, and welfare of these places, bringing greater voice and visibility to frontline communities who often cannot have a voice for themselves. So my first hat I'm going to wear is that of from the National AIA Board, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework for design excellence. And so what I would love for all of you to do is to avail yourselves of this new updated document. This is where the profession should be going. This has been developed by the National Code Committee, as well as many folks out there that are really looking at the leading edge of this. And if you've been involved with the framework for design excellence, this new update simplifies it, and the user interface is much more friendly. But we're trying to bring a couple of things together that is to bring into balance resilience, equity, health, along with net zero. Because the net zero sustainability side, we've been moving very well. We still need to move faster, but what's missing in that formula are those other three pieces to a measurable, successful place for architects. So I'm not going to do the video for this one, but this last year, the 4 outcomes that you can see here really brought this down to a couple of metrics. The first and foremost in zero carbon is to really work to align all of the internal and external scope and metrics, and how do we measure those? And then second part of that is to compile and promote the value of zero carbon and beyond as business case scenarios. So you can go into your next meeting and saying, no, this is what net zero can do for this project proposal, and give you tools by which you can use those elements. Same in resilience is develop an industry standard for measuring resilience. There is not one out there. There are many out there, but they do not align, and some of them are very specific to typologies. So the AIA is now moving forward with multiple committees to try to do that, and they're going to do that at the local level all the way to national to try to bring together an industry standard. Also to bring case studies together. You know, lawyers work from case studies. Architects, we work from case studies, but we don't have a catalog that says, here is a resilient project, and I can show local government or a client or a developer, this is what this means. And so the idea is just like we're doing with the zero carbon and the COTE Top 10, we're going to be doing that with resilience as well, right? So that once that standard is together and bringing all the case studies, understanding what the ROI is. And same with equity. What is the accurate representation and inclusion of the social costs of carbon metrics as well as those who are vulnerable to climate risks? And we want that data for you to use in your projects and to be able to measure that. And also to have some effective utilization of existing equity tools that are out there. So there's a gathering of that, and those resources will be available to you. On the health side, materials, what we found is cross-cutting materials, and how do we say, we're going to commit to the materials pledge? Great. But do those materials also answer equity? Where are they produced? Do they also answer resilience? Do they stand up to the shocks and stresses of that specific location? So taking material and that material pledge and cross-cutting all four of these was the goal. But ultimately, it came down to this. All four of these will have metrics and data that will support all four of those elements, and you should be doing that in your projects. That's the whole framework. And then the case studies will be available to you to hit each of those, and the best case studies will hit all four of those elements in the outcomes of the framework as the greatest exemplars to celebrate and to use as platforms to building on. And then the last one is, of course, materials. How do materials affect all of these? In addition to the Framework for Design Excellence, Resilience Design Toolkit is now available from AIA. It gives you two avenues. One is, how do I bring this into my office as part of project development? And two, how do I use this as a way of creating projects, right? So one is and it's a great document, so I suggest you download that. And the last one there is it's the Disaster Assistance Handbook that's out there. So the pre-disaster, it's something that's an advocacy tool for local governments. But ultimately, this is two sides of the same coin, resilience and sustainability. So this is a great kind of roadmap that says the sustainable development goals globally out there, here's what architects can do to meet each of these. And the great thing is cities and state entities have committed to sustainable development goals. New York State has done it. The sustainable development goals for the city are embedded in the documents that are out there. The stuff that Jennifer is showing out there really hit these. But the other side of that coin, and I'll share the slides of this as well, is the disaster risk reduction. So on the left side, many of you probably don't know the Sendai 2030. Sendai 2030 is disaster risk reduction. It's similar to the SDG goals, but it's all about disasters. That's on the left side. And how do you map those together? So we've been mapping those at AIA National to understand our framework for design excellence. If we're going to say resilience and sustainability, equity and health are all together, how do they work together? And so the global frameworks are now working together. The last two, COP 27 and 28, the thrust of the work at those is how does financing meet all of these agenda goals? But of course, us as architects, this has to be part of our project work going forward. So now I'm going to take that hat off. And I'm like, oh gosh, now I'm just going to talk about as a firm leader, an architect, and being in the room with architects. This is great. It's great to be at the Center for Architecture. And I was asked to give you a presentation on one of our projects. So I'm going to take you over to the island of Oahu. This is one of our projects that we've been working on for a long time. These are long lead projects. And I was asked to also, Jennifer asked, how do I decode the process? And I think that was an extraordinary pre-meeting because it completely changed the way that I wanted to present this project. Usually we're presenting it in a way that's completely different, but I think this is really great. Most of these projects start with community and understanding what the vulnerabilities are, right? And this is no different. This is the project that I will be discussing today. It's an entire campus of 5 acres on the North Shore of Oahu that has a great deal of vulnerabilities. And our process starts in this kind of a way. We always go through this. We assess the hazards of today and tomorrow. We always project forward because you're building for tomorrow. Analyze the site in a very profound way. Plan with the community and align with government and funding programs. And then design the site and buildings, and hopefully at that time you get to build the project. But there's a lot, as you know, a lot of pitfalls. So it sounds like probably these are the processes you do, but I do want to take you through those because when you're looking at building in frontline communities, and some of the things that we saw from Jennifer's project or presentation, is that when you do an assessment, there's already work that's been done for you. So we always align with the local hazard mitigation plan. We take all of the hazards and all hazard assessment and apply it to the site. Some of those were not prevalent to your site, but you must address all of them because you have to get into government speak. All of the funding you're going after has to align with that. But once we have all of those, then we take it to the next level, is what's not in the government documents are cascading effects. So we look at the climate hazard, then we look at the secondary hazards that come about along with short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes. And that's where we start to dig into how this is relevant to this community and what the vulnerabilities are there. What is the missing link? What is the weakest part to create a resilient, sustainable outcome for this project? And we take that framework and we align it with the FEMA 7 community lifelines. All federal funding really is aligned with this, and all the governments speak about when you're looking at safety and security, food, water, shelter, health and medical, energy, communications, transportation, hazardous materials. We map all of these for all the projects. We have to. FEMA announced about a month ago that they will be breaking water out as its own because it's so critical around the world. Too much water, too little water, wastewater, potable water. Everything to do with water will now be its own, an 8th community lifeline. And so what that means is that it really shows us the way forward. And working with indigenous communities, these are all Native Hawaiian, 7 Native Hawaiian villages that we're working with. We look at the 7-generation rule. So the 7 generations is about the respect for culture, character, beauty, and history of our state islands communities. And we really look at how our building or project or development must respond for that time frame. So bringing resilience and sustainability together to create equity, that's the two sides of the coin. But one thing I want to add is ecosystem services. So especially in the Hawaiian Islands, ecosystem services unlocks both sides of this coin. You cannot do any of this work without ecosystem services. And that rings true at COP 27 and 28. If you're going after funding from the World Bank, you must include ecosystem services in your proposal, otherwise they won't even look at it these days. That is really important. What that means is, folks, we're moving towards regenerative design really rapidly. So sustainability and resilience are no longer enough. You have to do regenerative design. It doesn't matter if you're in an urban environment. Take a look at Singapore. They've been doing it for decades and decades. So now we're going to go onto the site. So here's how we start our site analysis. You can see that red star right in the middle. That is our site. We are the furthest from any sort of place that you can imagine, but this is also the tsunami timelines from earthquakes. And that's part of the vulnerability assessment that we have to look at for this project. There's our site. It's this upper corner. It's the northwest corner of the island of Oahu, and here are the vulnerabilities from a Category 1 through Category 4 hurricane. This is just the water inundation. And our site is located, you can see that 5-acre site that's located here on the map. There's the site again in the center, and we're looking at the FEMA flood zone. So we're up and out of the FEMA flood zones, as well as the Category 1 through 4 maps, also the 5s. And then here's the extreme tsunami zone. So the red is the tsunami zone. The extreme tsunami zone is the yellow. And the western corner of our site is up and out of the extreme tsunami zone, telling us that even in the worst case circumstances, there's a place on this site that people are safe from the worst event you can possibly imagine, right? So just to dig in a little further, the site elevates rather rapidly. It goes up about 70 feet across the site to the back of the site, to that western corner, and that's the Hauula district that we're serving. There's 26,000 people in the district. There is not a single rated hurricane shelter at all. They're completely exposed with one road in and one road out, and the road is a coastal road. Just to give you a flavor of the site is completely overgrown. These are all invasive plants. We cataloged the entire site in 5 acres. There are only 5 trees that are native. And so that's a program that I'll go into a little bit later. So the next part is the community engagement. So in this community engagement, my community is self-aware, actualized, and invisible. That was one of the first quotes that came from the community leaders. They've been trying to build resilience and sustainability in their community for generations, and they're ignored by their local government. So we put together our planning team, or our team. So when you're doing this kind of work, as you know, the community is a big deal. So we have the residents, landowners, business, institutions, government, which includes city and county, state and federal, areas of legislature and funding are part of that, and then the design development team, which is us, a group called G70 on the islands. We've got, and SHADE, the SHADE Institute. So there's a lot of us involved in this. And I won't go through that whole slide, but you can see the complexity to bring that kind of a project together. And one thing here that we did discover in working with the community is cultural erosion. Between the ages of 18 and 35, everyone leaves because there's no job opportunities, there's no vocational training, there's no higher education available on the island. Everyone leaves, but then they all come back because they miss where they grew up and they want to raise their families there. So that missing middle creates a lot of issues. One, food security is an issue. There's 80 farms that surround this community, and they can't afford the food that they produce. They can't afford to eat the food they produce. They have to use that for economy. So we looked at that system as one of the things that we have to do. We have to bridge that gap, and somehow this site, 5 acres, has to be able to answer some of those issues. Under blue sky events, this entire community loses power 4, 5, 6 times a year. So the fragility of the old and aging infrastructure is an issue. What does energy autonomy look like for this community? 85% of the housing will be damaged from a Category 1 hurricane. So we know what the load of population is. If a Category 1 comes, we have to have a system for our community resilience hub that will shelter that many people as a minimum, not including the tourists that are there at the time and all of the other folks. The erosion wave inundation on king tides washes out the road constantly. So what you're looking at is that the infrastructure for transportation in and out doesn't work. So back to this slide, what happens here with the HMP? When we look at this, the federal funding tied to this is IRA funding, EPA funding, Homeland Security, FEMA, and HUD funding. And so once you identify all of those things and start your design process, you know how to aim the project process to the funding streams. And we've been receiving funding in almost all of these cases, and we have applications for other pieces. So on the island, they have their hazard mitigation plan, but specifically the OLA plan. And in the OLA plan, we found in bouncing forward that they want to do community resilience hubs. And that's great, because this community needs a community resilience hub. In fact, they identified one specifically in the town of Hauula in the literature of the government. So we're one of 7 that are proposed, and we'll be the first on the island. And to answer all of those climate issues, this is what's happening in the design that I'll be showing you, is that we're looking at 7 generations in the future. Transportation and supply chains means that we have to build the building to be isolated for 30 days for that entire population. 30 days of autonomous energy, water, food, all of those things. That's pretty specific. Strong winds, including hurricanes, rains, extreme tsunami zone. We're up and out of it. We know our location. We also have to look at wildfire. This is, sort of post-wildfire on Maui. We also have to look at the hazardous materials and active volcanoes and see how that impacts the site. But just to give you a flavor of that hazard research, just in terms of fire hazard, it was on everybody's mind, and so we've had to take the fire hazard mitigation planning that we'd done for the project and just did a recent presentation to make sure that folks knew that this was already part of the project process. And for that, we use a hazard vulnerability assessment tool that you can get online, and we begin to look at that and understand how this affects the project. But let me show you the project and how it applies to this. This is the main hub building, and this will be built to FEMA 361 standard, which is near absolute protection. And we have to have, this will house 1,500 people for a 30-day period with all power, water, food, everything necessary. It also double as the community center that's being relocated out of a flood zone. So, okay. So it did mess up a little bit. Well, what you're trying to see here, this is actually the defensible zones, 30 feet, 100 feet, and 200 feet around the properties. So I don't know why it's all messed up here, but this is the site plan includes a helipad, or the open field will be done so a helicopter can come in after disasters. But all of the xeriscaping and landscaping using natural features and green infrastructure is part of the hazard mitigation for fire. Now, one of the community workshops, we brought together stakeholders. This was during COVID for over a 2-year period. And we brought in facilitators, historians, and all sorts of people to do interviews, but also to work on this very specific site as a community to unearth all of the elements that they wanted to bring forward, not just understand the vulnerabilities. Now, safety was observed, and we had folks from the youngest generation available all the way to the elders that joined us. And identifying those priorities over 2 amazing workshops. We had every government official that joined us, along with those community folks, over 100 participants plus online teams. And we did these workshops with all of these stakeholders identifying all the priorities of the community. This holistic design approach really mined out the indigenous wisdom from a lot of the folks who had been there and could really go back generations upon generations to understand how things have changed. And here's a few of the faces of the community. One of the things that you can see up there on the left, that's Dottie, and she's one of the main community leaders that runs the current community center. The community has not had a voice. We've not been visible. The community engagement, getting together, talking, sharing, laughing, hurting together, whatever it is, builds bonds in the communities. They don't have a place to do that holistically. And the future of the community, so when we talk about sustainability, we sustain our life, and I believe it's helping sustain our culture. So there's a desire, even the youngest generation, to stop the erosion of culture in their community and give them opportunities. And from these lovely ladies, the wisdom of the community. What is really important is our ability to be effective and be able to engage the local people within the cultural context of livelihood. So you're getting a theme. Everyone we interviewed talked about the erosion of culture and the value of culture. The relationship to land and water are extraordinary. And lastly, this is for one of the last quotes that I'll show you is, we may be poor, but we're rich in our culture. That's why we still hang on. That's why we still do what we do. We fight for the next generation so they don't forget the culture. They don't forget where they're from and their roots. So just taking from that, some of the community queries that came out is reconnecting to the culture and the cultural knowledge through art, through some of the storytelling or talk story is what they do. And one of the things that came up, they want to create a Pono Center. And that's really this sort of really re-envisioning the relationship of people to culture, to place, to the land, to the air. So we had all of this before we even put pencil to paper, right? So this came up with, we came with 2 approaches out of all of the storytelling. The first is the underpinning idea that's about the ba'a. The ba'a is the traditional mariner's canoe, and then I'll talk about that second. And the other one is the ahupua'a, which is the traditional land management. Our site is located in a traditional ahupua'a with the upland part of the rainforest that comes through the site and all of the water runoff that goes down to the ocean. And we're in this integrated framing zone, which had been used for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the archaeologists had found some of the dry stack stone walls that were there. And so we had to understand what the use of the dry stack stone walls were, how they're used for water management, growing of food, and used as an ecosystem service that benefits the community and as well as the site itself. In fact, there's me with a lot of the folks from G70, our engineers out there, and we are volunteering to understand how these systems work fundamentally so we can design them into this project, right? So I did this for several weekends, and I brought some of my team over from our Los Angeles office. Very, very beneficial. The benefit of this is, one, remember all the invasive species that I showed you? Hawaii has a program to get rid of the invasive species and replant with native species. And we can define the native species as food producing species, because remember, one of the vulnerabilities is food insecurity. People have forgotten how to grow their own food. So this is a regenerative process, and really going beyond sustainability is really something that we strive for in the office, but this project is begging for that to happen because it must happen for the community. And not just for the food production and the plants, but it's also for the cultural aspect. So there's a lot more to that, but then I'll take you on to the Va'a. So in speaking with Dr. Tusi, he's one of the elders there, he talked about the mariners, the Polynesian mariners. Anytime a storm would hit you at sea, they would purposely flounder their boat, because when the boat is floundered, it holds its place in the water as the storm goes over, and then what you can do is still navigate by the stars. So it was really interesting. After that story, we started to do a lot of research. What happens when they come to an island they've never been to? Well, the fact is if they get there and a storm hits the island, they don't know where to shelter, so they flip over their canoe, they call huli va'a, and take shelter underneath. And so the project process began to take a look at what that is, and you can see the genesis of that. And once we presented this to the community, they were aghast. They were like, no one's really taken our culture and brought it into a contemporary context of architecture. No one. And this is all from the work with them, and they helped drive this design. So this project, as I said, is a FEMA 361 near absolute protection shelter for 1,500 people, 30 days off grid. It is up and out of the extreme tsunami zone, and it has all of these very stringent elements. It's clad with solar panels, rainwater harvesting. The ridge has wind turbines as part of the makeup. It uses geothermal as part of the loop, or at least that's the proposal to it. And in terms of the section, you can understand the section better with there's parking up above as well as parking underneath. And there are three areas for shelter. One is a food services area where the local farmers can come in and process their food to create local economy rather than selling it to a middle person, so that increases the value of what they're doing, and they've never had a place to do that. A gymnasium, which does not exist in 3 communities. There's no place for kids to play indoors, right? And then there's on-site medical and classrooms to do vocational training. We have a Windward Community College is one of the partners. They're going to do vocational training, so those kids at 18 don't leave as part of it. And then there's a Pono Center, which teaches cultural education from K through 12, language, art, everything. Those are all part of it. One of our great team additions is Tuoni. He is considered the master carver of all the Polynesian cultures as an elder. And so I got to meet with him, and he's committed to opening a carving school as part of the site as well. And they're going to be carving the entryway as well as the interior of the main spaces to carve the lineage of all of the local families as part of the interior. So think about it. When you're sheltering from a storm, you're surrounded by your family, the spirits of your family. So that is a very cultural piece. So that's all fine and good, but onto the sustainability side. So we have an ETIP grant, which is with Sandia Labs and Department of Energy. And we've taken this design and worked with them to understand how this becomes beyond net zero. We can have the 30 days off grid, all of those things. And so they considered everything from solar, wind, hydrogen, geothermal, hydro wave energy, all of those things in our design process. And what our mapping looks like is, and this is just a snapshot of the mapping, but there are 3 scenarios that have come forward, and these are choices that the community has to make, plotting the shocks and stresses, the ecological fitness, and the cost of this to the budget. And in these scenarios, you can see all the different pieces, and we've had 2 years of work with these folks. And those scenarios come out and really tell us that resilience, finance, environmental fitness have given us the answer of how to move forward with the energy side. We also have a FEMA technical assistance grant that I didn't include in the slides. Similar to the sustainability and energy production side, we have the resilience side for everything you can possibly imagine, from the medical and life safety and protection. So again, that's the last view of this. And just in terms of the cultural wisdom, they still have on the books that you can build traditionally in the islands. And so when Tuoni, the carver, is making a proposal, one of the buildings there is going to be community built in a very traditional manner. And it's called a haleba'a. So we took a look at how these actually work and how they've been adapted on the island. There's the Bishop Museum, haleba'a, and so there is a more contemporary context for it. and how they've used some of the things in Kauai where they've restored some of these land management issues. And the tertiary building there is called the secondary hub. This is where Windward Community College will have all their classrooms. And you can see that there is a resonance with that. This will also meet ICC 500, so it won't be resilient to that highest standard, but it will hit Category 3 hurricane fitness, and it's up and out of the tsunami zone as well. So this is where we're at now. This is an OLI. An OLI is a blessing for the site. So the site was granted back to the community for the next 99 years. They started by asking the spirits of the site, all the ancestors, if we could start work there. And so the OLI was our start. Then clearing the site was funded by some of those agency asks, and we hired a lot of locals to do the first part of the clearing of the site. Then we reached out to a lot of contacts, since I do a lot of disaster work. Team Rubicon, these are all retired military. They go and they help out after disasters, but they also will go and clear sites for you. So they cleared the rest of the site recently, and now here's what the site looks like. And we preserved the 5 existing trees, and that's state law, the native species, but you can see how much the invasive species are across the island, right? So thank you to the gray shirts. They're called the gray shirts. And so our next step is planting of 100 native trees. Since the site's already been cleared, the EA process is now complete, and that has moved forward. Public comment is finished. And we established that red line is a walking path that the community uses now to go around the site. They've had a lot of events there. In fact, from the top of the site, you can see they've had every Saturday they have a community farmers market, and they have quote unquote hay rack rides for the kids, things like that go on all the time. But there's the community, very, very happy. And my birthday was a couple weeks ago, so just bear with me. This is great news, is because if you look down, all the way down at the bottom, Hui o Haula, this town of Haula, this is our project. The Senate earmarked our project for $5.4 million. That is our Kickstarter for horizontal construction. So all of the horizontal features, everything from the helipad, all of those things, and the water management is being paid for from that pot of money. The local government has dedicated 3 years of funding to build the rest of the project, and then we're going after a FEMA BRIC grant for the community safe room side, which should pay for about 75% of the main building through the technical assistance grant. So that's how we decode the process. Does it go fast? No. We're at almost 5 years now. This will be done in another 3. So if you're doing this work, it takes a long time, but man, it's a lot of fun. It's great. And the last thing I'll leave you with. This is the first song produced in 30 years in the town of Haula about Haula. And it started the cultural regeneration because they were so happy about this process going forward. They started to write songs for the very first time in a long time. So with that, this is the last quote. The branches grow because of the trunk. Without ancestors, we would not be here. Very true for these projects. And it's when I say integrated, we have to integrate these things, and we have to go to regenerative process. If we're going to serve underserved communities, they have the answers that we need, especially in indigenous communities. They just need the assistance to visualize those to unlock the funding. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Daniel. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Ilya. As I'm sitting there, I sort of had the urge to ask questions, and even though I've seen outlines of your presentations before, and Ilya, you had this expression, decoding the process, and as I was listening to both of you, I was thinking really these sort of deep thoughts about the nature of architectural progress. How does it happen? And it's this messy leapfrogging process, very much in the case of sustainability and resiliency, unfortunately motivated by disaster, which is often the genesis of change. But it's really this leapfrogging process of case studies, innovation, followed by measurement, followed by regulation, followed by more innovation, followed by changes in regulation and updates in measurement. And with all of this, the world goes forward. And Jen, I think you said specifically, you look at case studies when you develop guidelines. And as we do our case studies, we look at the guidelines. So there's this very interactive process that happens, and it's impossible to describe other than, I think, through experience. And that's really something that I think, if anything, this presentation makes that point. As a case study, I think this is a very good complement to the one that Ilya presented. It's almost, even though it has many of the same motivations and the same goals, and addresses some of the same issues, climatic risks in terms of heat and precipitation, flooding. It is in every other sense the polar opposite. It is nearby, it is in southern Brooklyn, and it is at enormous scale. You can see here some of the statistics. It's almost 600 units. Almost 2,400 units. It's a 27-acre site. It's on the location of a former New York State psychiatric residential facility, which was disused, and presented this absolutely unique occasion to design in New York City on a multi-acre site, which practically never happens, and especially not in ground-up affordable housing. The project has been designed. It's currently under construction. This obviously will not be built all in one go, but there is a master plan and a general public project plan, which is filed with the state of New York, which is the state version of the ULURP that many of you are familiar with here in New York City. The first phase will be finished, fingers crossed, at the end of this year. The project is part of the Vital Brooklyn Initiative. I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar with it. If in case somebody is not, this is a holistic approach to housing, which doesn't just see housing as shelter, but sees it also as a source of community stability, personal health, community health, and so on. And of course, economic health as well in terms of job creation. And there were, I don't know how many sites as part of the Vital Brooklyn initiative. We've done a couple of the projects, and this project, Alafia, on site A, which is the largest site, accounts for about half the number of units in the Vital Brooklyn program. So where you live matters. So in terms of sustainability and resiliency, geography is in a large part destiny. That being said, however, the communities that line the southern bays of New York, the Upper Bay, the Lower Bay, Jamaica Bay, cover the gamut in terms of demographics, in terms of income, in terms of built environment. But if you wanted to take one neighborhood where the intersection of great social need and great environmental vulnerability intersect, it would be East New York, the Canarsie area of New York City, which is on Jamaica Bay in the area of South Brooklyn. It is in almost one of the most severe hurricane evacuation zones, which we can take as a proxy for flooding risk as well. And you can see in terms of the heat vulnerability index, it is very, very, very high up there. And we take that also as a proxy for personal health. So great need and great opportunity. In terms of our team, obviously this was not just us, Statner Architects, but a very large team. Our clients was a development partnership between L&M Development, which is one of the large affordable housing developers here in the city, as well as Apex Building Group, which is an MBE firm, which is also a developer in the affordable housing arena. And although we had many, many consultants on this project, I would like just to call attention to Scape, who are landscape architects. And Scape, it was a unique opportunity for us to have this degree of collaboration with a landscape architect in the pursuit of our sustainability goals. And Scape in particular is very much focused on environmental resiliency over large systems. A project of this size and complexity is not something you just build and walk away from. So the ongoing management of the development is in the hands of these two organizations, Riseborough and Services for the Underserved. The population for this complex, it's 100% affordable and at very low levels of income, and will also have an important population of people with mental and psychological disabilities, many of them formerly homeless, who will be living here. So high degree of social services, job training, healthcare, job creation, things of that nature. So a word about the context. I don't know if many of you are familiar with East New York and Canarsie. I certainly wasn't when this project started. Our firm is doing quite a bit of work in this area because there is obviously huge needs, so this is an area of great development focus right now. It is really, really at the edge of the city, both metaphorically and literally. Very isolated area, large tracts of it are given up to industrial zones, surface parking, bus fleets, Con Ed vehicle fleets, things like that. It is right near the BQE. There is a certain amount of natural beauty. You are near Jamaica Bay, so you have the benefits of the proximity of the ocean as well as the risks. And to give you a sense of the relative lack of urbanity in this neighborhood, something that most closely approximates an urban fabric is the Gateway Mall, which is right across the street from our project. The mall has a number of large big box stores, but also smaller businesses. It has some outdoor plazas, and that's where people congregate. People come from all over Brooklyn with their cars to shop there. But right now, if you went there, you would think, oh, this is a core. That just tells you in a relative sense how very much at the edge of the city this feels like. It is rapidly changing. There are a number of large-scale housing projects going on there right now. There were, of course, in an earlier iteration of public housing development, a number of large-scale projects like Starrett City that have been around for a couple, 2 or 3 decades already. But then you have more recent initiatives like this Nehemiah affordable housing, which is, I think, part rental, part ownership housing, low density, low scale, very different from what we attempted. There are also, as part of the Jamaica Bay restoration, there's a new state park out there, which is just across the street from our development. So the conceptual genesis of the project, and I'm going to describe it quickly in order to get to some of the sustainability aspects. The development team saw this tying in with the Vital Brooklyn concept of personal and community health and housing all wrapped into one, this idea of blue zones being these areas in the world where people live a long time to a ripe old age, and typically they're characterized by very high levels of social cohesion and what we would call in America life-work balance. They, of course, don't call it that. We saw it a little bit differently. We saw this in urbanistic terms as a 15-minute neighborhood. And just for those of you who don't know, 15-minute neighborhood basically means that a neighborhood where you have all of your daily amenities in terms of shopping, in terms of transportation, in terms of services, within a very tight walking radius of approximately 15-minute, either walking radius or public transportation. So we encompass the Gateway Mall and several other neighborhood landmarks within the area. And we set out not simply to design a series of buildings, but really a true neighborhood. So, and we built this idea the neighborhood identity around 3 scales, going from the smallest one, which is personal identity. How do you find yourself in this very large project? Here's my front door, here's my window, here's my building. It's different from all the other ones. I can identify immediately where I fit in the project. Then the larger identity, which is a community identity built around a group of buildings with shared spaces, both indoors and outdoors, defensible spaces, which are just for the residents of those buildings and not for the project as a whole. And then the larger identity around the entire development and extending outwards into the local community. So this is not a campus in the sense that it is not a gated space. This is open to the surrounding neighborhoods. There are 3 New York City owned and built public streets that are carrying through this new development. So there are no gates, there are no barriers, and the public can come into the space. And here, just a quick description. So they are about 10 or so buildings. The large part of them are residential. They line the major streets to the east and the west. The ones that are on the west face the mall. They have local retail in the base, as well as a health clinic. You can see the 3 New York City streets crossing the development from east to west. And then there are a number, in addition to these mixed-use buildings, there are a number of non-residential buildings. One is a community facility and center in which there'll be a number of cultural activities that take place there. There is a manufacturing building which will partner with an urban farm, which is also part of the development. So we have about an acre of outdoor urban farm space and about an acre of indoor urban farming space. And that food will be collected and processed, and I'll talk in more detail a little later about what happens to it. In the future, there will also be, once the site has sufficient population and density, a new New York City public school, which is independent of the project, which will be built by the city, by the DOE and the SEA at some point in the future. In addition to these roadways, there are also secondary paths. Some of them are shared roadways, both for vehicles, service vehicles, move in, move out, but also for cyclists and pedestrians. They'll be shared. And then there's a series of uniquely pedestrian paths, including a 1-mile fitness loop that takes you around all the buildings. And here are some of the typical spaces. So we have front doors, which are shared accesses and addresses and points of orientation on the street for the buildings, as well as individual entrances to garden apartments at the ground level. It's meant to animate the ground level and increase the amount of traffic and entrances and exits that you see. And then within the individual buildings, these shared courtyards for the residents. This one happens not to be at grade. It's 1 story up. There's a certain amount of parking that we had to accommodate on the site. So this building, which is actually Building C, which is part of the first phase, which is under construction right now, has parking below it. And here we see one of the beginning of one of those New York City public streets that crosses through the site. These streets are, in a sense, typical New York City DOT-built public streets, but they're also part of a bigger DOT pilot program that has to do with site resiliency. And this will have local commerce, cafes, and then residential buildings all around. Here's a shot of the manufacturing building. So the partner business in this case is going to be Meals on Wheels, which prepares meals and distributes them to homebound people, seniors, sick people throughout the city. So they will be preparing the meals, preparing the kits here. The trucks will come pick it up. Some of that food will come from the urban farms. That is the plan. The cultural building in the middle of the site, you can see both the manufacturing building and this building have green roofs. So maximizing the amount of impervious surface, of course, was one of the goals of the project, as well as for these buildings, which are in the middle and which are of the site, and which are the lowest buildings. All the residential buildings look down on them, so the roof is the fifth facade, and it becomes part of this larger interior park around which the residential buildings are constructed. This is the maintenance hub, which is where basically it's central trash collection for all the buildings. This is a vital part of the project because none of the buildings can work independently of this maintenance hub. So in addition to centralizing trash collection, it has composting, it has recycling, it has sorting, baling, all of these things. And it will serve as one of the local sources of employment. This will be managed by Riseborough and staffed by local residents. And here's phase one. So you can see Building C over there on Erskine Avenue, a piece of the new New York City public street, and then the maintenance hub there at the bottom of the image. So in terms of flood risk, so as you saw, the site is somewhat protected from being in the worst flood zone by the natural man-made barrier of the BQE, as well as the natural tidal wetland zone that characterizes most of Jamaica Bay, which is a very important element in this area, as well as the construction of Shirley Chisholm State Park, which is a man-made landfill just across from the BQE, but still it is very high risk of flooding. And the management of risk is really a key part of this project. And as I was listening to your description, Jen, of all of these new guidelines and standards, it occurred to me that we just missed the first edition of the Climate Resilience Design Guidelines. But I'm proud to say that many of the conclusions we reached about mitigating storm risk are in fact part of the prescriptions of the guidelines. So I'm not sure if we conform absolutely, but retroactively we are very close to both the thinking and the logic and hopefully the outcomes of the guidelines. And you can see what the risks are. So in 2020, maybe half of the site is at the 100-year floodplain level, but 60 years hence, it's a little hard to see the colors, at least from where I'm standing. About 2/3 of the site are below the 100-year floodplain level, and the 500-year floodplain is now starting to lap at the edges of the site. So this was definitely a concern, and the CRDG, if we were doing this project today, this would be classified as a long-lived residential project, and the milestone benchmark that you would use in terms of flooding, looking into the future, would be 2080. And the 2080 projections cover a range of flooding, because all of this is projections and all of it is uncertainty, somewhere between 2070 and to the end of the century. And the major factor in risk evaluation is time. And so the further out you go in time, the greater amount of uncertainty, the greater the amount of projected cost to mitigate the perceived risk, but also the higher the risks, but also the higher the level of protection. If you use a short-term framework, then your risks are better known, but they are lower in terms of the threat. They are lower in terms of the mitigation, but they're also lower in terms of protection. So that is the constant balancing act that you have to deal with. And the CRDG does have a methodology for establishing this. It's a benefit cost analysis. And what it does is it takes the present value of the project and it makes an estimated projection of the future benefits that the project will bring, and then it discounts them to the present. And it's a complicated formula, but it allows you to compare your current costs with the benefits in current cost terms. And it's a complicated formula, and I've never used it, so I can't ascertain as to how, as to what the results would have been in this particular case. But our approach to addressing this risk were not dissimilar to the recommendations of the CRDG. And basically, what we looked at was a series of probable flood estimates extending out in time. And you can see that the degree of uncertainty increases, that's the bottom line, as does the level of flooding. And very diagrammatically, this outline shows the height of the site, the height of the surrounding streets, and the sea level. So we had a couple of, we basically, we're not unlimited in terms of what we could do in terms of the elevation of the site. For obvious reasons, cost is a consideration, but also elevating the site is, you still have to transition to the surrounding context, which of course is not changing in elevation. So where we situated buildings on the site, how we made the transitions to the surrounding street was a complicated and iterative process. The strategy for dealing with flood on the New York City waterfront is one of adaptation, and it's multi-layered. Some of it is regulatory, some of it is insurance, some of it is the built construction. And of the three strategies, classes of strategies that it recommends, the first being flood proofing and hardening of a site, the second being raising the building, the third one, which is raising the entire site, is the most onerous and expensive one, and the rarest one because there's relatively little opportunity to do that. That's what we did here at Alafia. And there are basically three components to that. So one is the base flood elevation, which is a projection. Two is the amount of freeboard, which is the margin of error above that projection. And depending on whether it's a critical facility or a non-critical facility, that margin of error changes. So the overall site is deemed to be non-critical, except for one small component you can see in the corner of Building C, which is a health clinic. So if you're critical, you have to have 2 feet of freeboard. If it's non-critical, 1 foot of freeboard. This is a zoning requirement. And where we ended up is with the entire site of Alafia becomes almost like an island in the case of a flood event. There are areas in the neighborhood which are at higher elevations, but you can see the surrounding area is entirely within the 100 and 500 flood zone area. And because the site is open to the rest of the neighborhood, even though it is not properly speaking, an emergency center, it would de facto become an area of refuge in case of an event. Finally, the third component is the estimated sea level rise. So again, we projected forward, and the sea level rise that we used was towards the high end of the estimate. Parts of the site were already at a sufficiently high elevation, but not the entire site. So I don't recall the exact amount, but I think in aggregate, the amount of fill that we need on this site is roughly 2 feet over 27 acres, which is an enormous amount of fill. Some of it will come from excavation that we're doing from the site, but some of it is going to have to be brought into the area from elsewhere. In addition to flooding, we also have concerns about absorption and precipitation and factors that on their own can present flooding risks, but could certainly aggravate storm surges and events like that. And so what we try to do is overall maximize the amount of pervious areas on the overall site. And I'll show you in a minute a comparison between the existing condition and the current design condition, but also to adopt a series of stormwater management systems to deal with the impervious areas of the site. So some of those are featured here. We have rain gardens, we have runnels that slow down the water and direct them towards absorptive areas. We have bioswales. Those are built along all of the major inner streets, including both the private streets that we are developing and as part of this New York City DOT program, as part of their pilot street design. And their street design includes things like the bioswales, but also pervious street pavements at the edge of the street, which are these precast pervious concrete panels that have drainage layers beneath them and that basically are at the edge of the street right at the curb. And finally, we have a significant amount of on-site retention, and this was, I think, a fairly sort of contemporaneous innovation for Alafia, but I think has since become very much widespread. Instead of the traditional concrete, low-profile retention devices that they typically put under streets and parking lots, these are these plastic domes. They are basically wrapped in a layer of gravel, which is then wrapped in a layer of filter fabric, covered top and bottom. They remain hollow inside, so they retain the water that trickles down through the filtering mechanism. They fill up, and if there is really a severe case where the ground becomes totally saturated, then there is a relief system which basically takes the overload into the storm sewer system. So the idea, of course, is to retain water temporarily and then release it into the surrounding area. And you can see these are widely distributed over the entire site. And the result is this, and I think it's kind of a little eye-opening. So we have a modest decrease in, modest decrease in impervious area. So, or rather, I should say, a modest increase in impervious area, which was our goal. But you can see that the population density of the site has gone from this low-rise facility, which covered almost all of the site, had a large amount of internal roadways and parking lots. We've multiplied the population of the site by a factor of 10. And so in terms of absorption, in terms of flood risk, there is an enormous amount of progress, but also this incredible densification of the site. And here the hopeful message is that you can do both at the same time, and really this is the key, in our opinion, for coastal communities. And here are some projects of where we are today or a few months ago. And with any luck, the first building will be TCO'd slightly ahead of schedule at the end of the year. And people will start moving in. The health clinic will be brought online shortly after that. And the second set of buildings is already, I believe, permitted, and construction for those buildings will start shortly. And there will be a series of leapfrogging design and construction phases, 6 phases overall for the entire project. And I think it'll take about a decade to build the whole thing out. And with that, I conclude my presentation.
Of course. I think I'm well rested.
Can folks, do we need the microphones? Can folks hear us? Yes, we need the microphones. Okay. Okay, great presentations. Thank you all. We're going to do some Q&A, but first I have a few questions myself, and we're going to start with Daniel, and then we can open up to Ilya and Jennifer. First, an observation that you've taken, what would be considered a constraint or a difficulty or problem with the site, and you've made it a beautiful, wonderful design feature, which is all that open space and the impervious surfaces is really fantastic. In that, you were trying a new thing. You're trying a new way of dealing with rainwater. So, and I know that's something that your firm is always pushing, trying new things. Can you talk a little bit about when you do that, how you talk to your client about, okay, we're trying a new thing, you're kind of the guinea pig, here are the advantages to it, and here's how we're going to overcome some of your fears in adapting it.
Hello? Well, that's a good question. There are probably multiple answers to that. But I would say, for one, we were lucky, particularly in this case, to have a client who is not only interested, but willing and able. There are a number of these of features in the building that I didn't talk about at length. For example, and most obviously, that there are passive house buildings, which is something that is increasingly common, but obviously requires some commitment on the part of the client. I think our strategy is never simply to propose one thing, but to propose multiple solutions to everything when we can, and realizing that there's always a trade-off between costs and results. And we've been lucky enough to have clients who think that way as well. So sometimes things are simply not possible just because they're simply unaffordable in this type of project and with this underlying financing basis. But we've been lucky in our choice of clients, and again, we try to be agnostic about the solutions and open to innovation, and hope for the best.
I think that's really smart. You lay out, the options, and you sort of let the data speak for itself.
Right, and obviously having the data is key, and I think we're fortunate to be in the times that we are, in that there is more and more of that around.
Yeah. So that leads me actually to my next question, which is for both of you, which is where do we get that? So for things like energy, we have really good data, and it's, we can quantify that. We've talked today about things like resilience and social equity. Where are we with being able to get data about feedback about how some of these systems are performing, and what are the next steps? So we'll start, Ilya, with you, maybe talking a little about the framework, and then Jen, if you could talk a little bit about what HPD's, how you're thinking about tracking resilience strategies and their effectiveness.
Well, sure. Happy to put that other hat back on. So for the Framework for Design Excellence, the multiple committees involved at the national level and as well here locally the alignment of that to gather data, that is underway. So the best answer that I can say for the 3 out of the 4 of those, or 2 out of the 4 of those. So materials, with the materials pledge, there's a lot of data in the material testing for health concerns, where it comes from, the red list, all of those things. How we track that data is by reporting from firms and from the suppliers themselves, how much of that uptake is going on. So that's trackable, as well as the sort of, we've been very good at carbon counting over these last several years. Our efficiency and our knowledge about how to do that's great. But the resilience side, you know, for example, National Institute of Building Sciences, they do great work. NIST, anything that's federally funded, they will go back and look at projects that they've funded for resilience and evaluate after a disaster how well it performed, to report back to government to say, you invested well. So there are pieces of it, but that needs to come forward. And so, you know, stay tuned for that answer, right? And then on the health one, we're actually turning to the health sciences, and the health sciences are extraordinarily important. Luckily, you know, unfortunately we had COVID, but the fortunate outcome of that is that the advancement of the WELL standard and a lot of the standards that are out there that really look at healthy environments have now been able to integrate into that process. So you'll see that very much so in the framework for design excellence, but you can also see it when you apply it in NYSERDA and other places. That are you going after these healthy communities, healthy spaces, healthy materials? And so they're there, and the role that we're seeing at the AIA nationally is to be able to make it easier for you to answer that question. How do we combine these, how to report them, and what are the best sources that are credible, so we can continue to help one another with that. Thanks.
I'm not sure I have quite as much to add to that, but we have started enhancing our data collection, right? The city does benchmarking, HPD does benchmarking. What we haven't done to date is actually pull in as data all of the things we're integrating into our building that are affecting the outcomes. And that's really important for us because we do so many buildings and have such a touch point. It's going to be harder for sure on the resiliency side because what the outcome is avoided things, avoided deaths, avoided health risks, right? Avoided damage. I don't know that we'll get to that, but when we do a look back after an event, we'll be able to say, these are the buildings with these features that have performed better, right? And we'll be able to translate that into some kind of action.
Great. I mean, I think what we're driving at, and I think you can all sort of chime in on this, is as I think probably mostly architects and designers in the room, and we're coming to a project, and we're thinking about resilience, and obviously in your flood zone, you're going to deal with flood zone, but how, like Daniel, what you did, how do we begin to go beyond what the code is asking for and say, this is how we can think about addressing things that are going to happen in 20 years and 50 years, and how can we begin to take that list, that great list actually from HPD, or I think it's actually the city's climate mitigation plan, and begin to pick the most effective one. Are we there yet, or are we still a few years away from identifying those? I'm sorry, I've dropped a hard question in your lap.
I don't know if you ever get there. So I'm not sure if you ever get there, just because I think that progress will be incremental and therefore seem almost infinite. I would say that that's kind of the nature of it. I mean, I think for us on this particular project, it had never struck us as sort of starkly that risk is managed over time, and I think the first mental habit is to see the project in that light, to see it in terms of its longevity, which is not, I think, something that I personally, as an architect, was used to thinking that way. I mean, we think of buildings as eternal, but we all know that they're not. And certainly the design focus and the priorities when a construction is under design are always limited in some way by that sense of time. So for us, that was the major revelation of this project. So I don't know if that's exactly answering your question, but that is the sort of analytical framework that I think drives this innovation, rather than just a technical orientation, right?
I think the good news is every code cycle, every 3 years, resilience takes a bump up. It's the issues with the older buildings and retrofit, and so I was very happy to hear about the retrofit and some of the things that are coming forward to the city. So will we ever get there? No, not at all. But in that state of becoming and that advancement, noting that the minimum standard, the absolute minimum of code keeps advancing every 3 years. If you build to code now in South Florida, you will survive most of the wind and water elements that happen. You will, with the energy code that's implemented, survive extreme temperature swings, right? And if that is the absolute minimum metric keeps coming up every 3 years, our issue is the 80% of the buildings that need to be retrofitted and will never be replaced. Their location and geography that's changing because of time, that is another issue, which is a long-standing, what do we do with managed retreat? And what do we do with the elements that are left behind, and how do we take those buildings out and turn that into benefits to communities for new wetland restoration, all of those things. That, to me, is the larger question, because we will never get to that place where resilience is adopted. On the business side, we only take projects that meet that ethos, and all of our projects that come to us are, oh, well, you're going to design for us something that is resilient and sustainable. Absolutely. So I think that's the marketplace has shifted because insurance has shifted completely. And so if your finance model has shifted, there's no going back to any other way. It's just, now how do we get there at speed? How do we activate that and really invest?
I would add to that. So, Ilya, you said much more eloquently what I was trying to say. So there is this leapfrogging effect of design advances followed by regulatory and insurance and things like that sort of set a minimum, and then the design goes a little bit above that. In terms of risk, I think one of the things too that's worth mentioning, and that this is why progress is in a sense infinite, is that risk can never go to zero. It's simply impossible, right? And so you're always managing that risk. And once the floor has been established in terms of minimum standards, then the risk horizon moves out a little bit, but you never get to 100%. Yeah.
Great. I want to open it up for questions in just a second. But that sprang to mind, is there a kind of project that we just shouldn't be taking? So is there like with managed retreat and what we know about climate change, is there are there places where we just shouldn't be building? And I'm thinking specifically in New York, where we are still building. What's the role of the architect?
So my opinion is that having worked with the state on the climate impact assessment in the buildings chapter, the amount of risk that's already out there for our communities, the insurance companies have already stopped insuring in high-risk zones. That tells you that equity is falling flat. Our communities now are facing, I cannot even sell my home because it's uninsurable, losing generations of wealth buildup. And we're seeing that all over the U.S. 134 million people are in the zones of risk in the next 50-year time horizon. 134 million people in the U.S., that's 1 in 3. So when you think about that, we should be investing in those people to how we can change that paradigm, but we should not be building in those zones other than restorative wetlands and things like that, in my opinion, in that short answer, right? But.
And the best tool for that are the sort of flood maps that project out 100 years is our best tool.
All risk tools,
yeah.
Looking at all risk is really important, right?
Okay. I have like 100 more questions, but I want to see if anybody in the audience had questions. Yes, please, go ahead. Or I can bring you the... Yes.
Hi, this question I guess is mostly for Daniel and also HPD, but when you're creating density, at the far edges of the city where transit isn't great, have you been able to work with the MTA and the Transit Authority to get commitment to changing transit patterns to serve these areas? Because, I mean, my experience has been you build it and then a few years later everybody says, oh, we can't get anywhere, and maybe they respond, maybe not.
I did not talk about transit kind of on purpose.
Sorry.
because of the very sort of kind of situation that you described. Oh. Because it's such a difficult issue. So Alafia suffers from the last mile problem, is that it's slightly beyond the reach of the subway. We have addressed it somewhat, at least in the short term, in that there will be an increase in bus service and a number of new bus stops that basically will be situated around the perimeter of the project. Some of them exist today, but not all of them. So you will get off a bus and you will be fairly close to your front door. Whether this is in the long term a satisfying solution, difficult to say. At some point, the density of these neighborhoods, if they continue to develop at their current rate, not just at the water's edge, but slightly further inland, would that justify in the long term extensions of the subway system? I don't know, but that is perhaps a possibility. And then there are other kinds of alternatives that we looked at, and they're embryonic in our master plan in terms of micro networks of shared vehicles and charging stations and things like that. Outer Brooklyn is still very much a car culture. And the state was particularly sensitive to that, which is why we have the parking that we have on the site. And then some of these, as I said, the still embryonic initiatives about vehicle sharing and short-term car ownership and things of that nature. But as far as public transportation goes, our suggestion was basically to reinforce the train to bus network, which at this point was the most we could consider.
I'll just quickly say on the city side, right, it's a multi-agency effort, right, to try and figure out where to build, where not to build, and to balance making sure that there's a provision of services for people still in at-risk areas, right? Like, we can't pull everybody out at once, right? So making these decisions is a really complex set of, conversations at any point, right? We need housing. We have risk, we need transit. So there's not a really clear answer. It's an ongoing process on the city side. Not the perfect answer, we know.
I had a very quick question. Thank you all, Jennifer, Ilya, and Daniel, for a great presentation. I guess my question is more geared towards you, Ilya, in terms of sort of meta thinking and design sort of planning strategies. You used the term ecosystem services, which is a term that personally I was unfamiliar with, and probably many of us are. It sort of sounds abstract. So can you just re-review the concept of that? And then,
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, ecosystem services, it turns out that 2/3 of the people in the world rely on their livelihood and economy from ecosystem services. And that's not just farming, that's everything associated with the natural environment. And so the investment opportunity and the funding that's out there to restore ecosystem and provide that as job opportunity or related to job services is enormous throughout the world. By 2050, it's a $4.5 trillion business opportunity for eco-services restoration planet-wide. And that comes out of the World Bank, and they're funding it. That's why when you go after projects, when you look at green infrastructure, does a green infrastructure also provide what else to the community? In our case, it's providing food. We're also propagating breadfruit trees, so each community member has a breadfruit tree in the front and the backyard. That is an ecosystem service that provides 3,000 pounds of high-quality food for a family in a single year with 2 trees. And so that's an example of ecosystem services. The other is agroforestry, agropharma. So forest management, not just for the sake of keeping the forest, but what do you harvest out of the forest on a sustainable level? And this is not just, we're going to take a wood product, but the other products from those services, in a lot of the native communities, agropharma, harvesting native plants or plants that have medicinal uses that turns into a business opportunity is part of ecosystem services. What it's done in the finance sector, I'm sorry there's a longer answer, is to reevaluate your assets. So the Global South has assets in ecosystems, and so banking and finance is now looking at that instead of saying, oh, well, you know, you're a carbon sink. No, they're looking at that saying, your forest is worth X number of dollars that we will invest in your country to help pay for the other things that are associated with it. So it's a complete change in financing. So I would take a look at it. And they also launched what's called EPD, which is, it's the Ecological Development Goals, and they really talk about ecosystem services. So take a look at the documents that have come out of the Montreal COP15 from December of 2027. You'll get all of the information you need there and just leap forward into that. Thanks.
Any other questions? No. Parting words, parting thoughts?
This was fun.
Thank you so much. The presentations were excellent, and the discussion really informative, and I really appreciate the great discussion, and thanks everyone for coming.